As I record this, it is September the 26th, Saturday. I'm out on the porch, and I'm going to try to do it from here. Looks like we've got decent light, and it's coming through okay. It's about 76 degrees or whatever. Trying to take advantage of probably some of the last days that it's going to be really nice to be out on the porch and sit and do these kinds of things. Anyway, my video today is about the first lesson in October on our Lifeway quarterly. For those of you who do not use Lifeway, I'm sorry, but that's what we're following, as I've decided to continue on with that, as our senior class voted unanimously to use that book. And the lesson this morning comes to honor marriage. When we were married, assuming all of you were, maybe a couple of you weren't, I know, there's no demand that anybody has to be married, but the Lord said to multiply. And if we follow His reasoning, we only logically, willingly, through His commandments, able to multiply through marriage. So we're going to honor marriage. When we did the oath, it says, until death do us part. Well, several of you who will watch this on YouTube, as this is one of the first ones in the month of October that I'm going to put on there, some of you have already succumbed to having a spouse leave you, as I have. But what judges or others who can legally join the union of a man and woman have asked the people getting married to repeat over and over, along with these and a few other things that you're going to love and cherish. But this has been true for all the years that the U.S. has existed, until 2013. That's when the U.S. decided by a law, and I'm not quite sure how it ever got passed, but it did, that there was a law now permitting marriage between the same gender. But God said it was between a man and a woman. He set up Adam and Eve that way. He set up everything to be that way. So we must honor marriage that way in God's law. Whether you agree with or just, okay, it's U.S. law and you're going to abide by it, whatever, it doesn't matter. If you want to abide by God's commandment, it's not the liberal day of 2013. A marriage is between a man and a woman. So many in our society no longer value the traditional marriage, the lifelong covenant between a man and a woman. It's only when a biblical marriage that couples experience the highest joy, unity, and security when it's between a man and a woman. Since God-centered marriages also provided the ideal environment for raising children. Same gender, sex, can't produce a child. They can adopt them, of course, but they can't produce them. Well, our first scripture from this lesson is in Exodus 20:14. And it simply says, thou shalt not commit adultery. It forbids all acts of uncleanness with all those desires. No less than 3 of the 10 commandments, the 5th, the 7th, and the 10th, directly involve strengthening marriages and families and preserving unity and sacredness. Of course, all of God's commands, if followed, will work to strengthen man's relation with God and other men and women. But these three were aimed directly at securing the sacred bonds of marriage and a family. The Seventh Commandment, which is the one I just read, forbids adultery, unfaithfulness by either spouse. It stands against anyone who would defile the sanctity of a marriage covenant through sexual sins. Adultery is probably the most dishonored act among the bidding contract of a marriage relationship. Of a binding contract. Not only is it a sin against one's companion, but here's what Paul teaches in 1 Corinthians 6:18. It's a sin against one's own flesh. Besides, of course, being a sin against God. A marriage can stand against many adversaries from without, but this sin destroys it from within. And few, if any, marriages can truly recover from such infidelity. I don't want to get into the lasting years of same-sex marriage, and that's not really the purpose here. I just want to say that that's not God's law, and just leave it at that for now. Jesus said in Matthew 5:28 that adultery begins in the heart. It is more than an outward action. Sometimes it's just lust that comes from within. Christ teaches that if we have a sexual desire, even in our thoughts, we may be committing adultery and breaking the commandment. Now, if we view a woman, if you're a man, or a man, if you're a woman, as being good looking, and that's not necessarily what we're talking about here, having desires. Just appreciating the beauty that God made. But it is if it goes beyond that. So the other part of this commandment is that marriage had its origin at the dawn of human history. We know Adam and Eve. They were together for life. And while the world understanding about marriage has been changed and warped, God's design has never been changed. He planned for marriage to be a lifelong covenant between one man and one woman, who would honor their relationship with faithfulness and purity. And I did in my marriage. For all the 45 years we were married. And I know she did too. And I will never consider another union of any kind but the one I had. And I'm looking forward to the day in heaven when I can see Barbara again. Sure, most of all to see Jesus, obviously, but to see Barbara and to tell her I love her again. God had Moses to record a man who sleeps with a man as with a woman is condemned. This also condemns a woman who sleeps with another woman. While there's no specific Hebrew word for homosexuality, the Bible in both the Old as well as the New Testament clearly states in many places that it's against God's will, and referring to these acts as what brought about the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. Anytime you see those words, you know what he's talking about. Moving along, let's move along to 2 Samuel. 2 Samuel 11, 1 through 3a. Our lesson chooses to stop at 3a for this one. We'll see why in a moment. In the spring, at the time when kings go off to war, David sent Joab out with the king's men and whole Israelite army. They destroyed the Amorites and besieged Rabbah, but David remained in Jerusalem. One evening, David got up from his bed and walked around on the roof of the palace. From the roof, he saw a beautiful woman bathing. This woman was very beautiful, and David sent someone to find about her. Well, it came to pass that after the year had expired, or the end of the year as the Targum Bible talks about, in the month of Adar, or February as we know it now, the spring of the year, it was a time that the kings go forth in battle, just what they did in those days. It was a fit time to go out to war. The rains were over, and there were grass in the fields, fruit in the trees, corn was ripe, so food for horse and men was plentiful. This month we call Nisan, 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 or Nisan, if you want to use the different word. From military banners were erected. So by the Romans, it was called Martius, and by us, March, from Mars, the god of war. Well, this is the time that David sent them out to war. And we see that David decided to stay there. He didn't go out. He stayed in Jerusalem. We're not quite sure why David decided to do that. Maybe David was tired. Certainly he was getting a little older. He'd been out on battles all the time. Maybe it was Satan. Or maybe it was God presenting something to test him. We don't know. We can conjecture all we want. But anyway, David did not combat the temptation. He wanted to understand more about or see more of Bathsheba. And so the temptation of adultery had begun. And this became the faithfulness and purity that David was trying to guard against, but it came about. Now, in those days, we know David had more than one wife. I could go into a couple of stories. Michelle, the daughter of Saul, was his wife for a while. We know that he found another one on the battlefield, and she protected the army by going to her then husband, who the Lord took her husband, and she became free, so David married her. Well, anyway, David noticed the beautiful Bathsheba, but had not acted in any great sin. Had he not acted in any great sin, rather, nothing would have occurred. But he called and asked to have Bathsheba brought there. Now, we don't know whether Bathsheba was willing. Maybe she was on the roof, and it was purely coincidental that she was out there bathing at a time when David had come. Maybe it was her desire. We don't know. But in any case, Bathsheba certainly could have prevented it if she had not been out there where David could have seen her. We don't know in what area of clothing, or degree of clothing, I guess is a better way of putting it, that Bathsheba was in when David saw her. We know that sometimes when they're bathing, why they are not completely undressed, but maybe significantly so. But maybe David just wanted to see more of her. But anyway, it was a desire. Then it may still have been a sin according to Jesus, just if he had not even asked for Bathsheba to come, just because maybe he had the desire of that. He could have respected her beauty without any desire, as I said earlier, people can, but he didn't. So if he had not pursued Bathsheba, he would not have committed at least the gross sin. Maybe a sin of desire would have still been there, but maybe not. James 1:4-15 states, each person is tempted when he is drawn away and enticed by his own evil desire. Then after desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin, and when sin is fully grown, it gives birth to death. This is one incident in David's life, provides a perfect but tragic illustration of James' truth. Moving along, our third area of scripture, and our last one in this particular video, is in 2 Samuel 11:3b, as we pick up the rest of 3, and goes to verse 5. The man said, she is Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, and the wife of Uriah the Hittite. Then David sent messengers to get her. She came to him, and he slept with her. Now she was purifying herself from her monthly uncleanness. Then she went back home. The woman conceived and sent word to David saying, I am pregnant. We know many tragic incidents occurred during the time of David, prior to his kingship with Saul, and during his kingship. Certainly, this is the case with King David in this particular one. A little vacation from the war, because he didn't go out on war, led to a day spent in bed, following by a stroll along the roof, and seeing a woman bathing. And David fixed upon that and investigated her identity. We are told in these verses that she was summoned where David slept. Even though he knew that she was the wife of Uriah, one of his warriors, who was out fighting right now in the army of Israel. So, when Bathsheba became pregnant, David said, well, I got to do something about this, don't I? If he'd have left it alone at that, yeah, it'd have been a sin, and it'd have been a tragedy, but he compounded it. As sometimes we attempt to do when we try to cover up. You know, the old saying, cover up sometimes is worse than the act. Well, I'm not sure if it's going to be worse than this act, but it would certainly been better to not try to cover it up. Well, David said, I got to do something. So he called Uriah home. And his thought was, well, I'll get Uriah to go home and be with Bathsheba, spend some time and nights with Bathsheba, and give him a break in the action. And then we know that Uriah's could have had time to make Bathsheba pregnant, and it could have been his child. So David gave orders to Joab, the commander, and had Uriah come home. Uriah would not go home. He slept outside the palace. He said, I'm not going to go out and spend a night with my wife in a home when all my other comrades in arms are out there in the battlefield. I'll rest a little bit, but I'm going to go back. And David gave him a second chance to do that, and he did not do it again the second time. So now, what was David to do? He gave orders to Joab that he put Uriah on the front line, essentially almost guaranteeing Uriah's death in battle. And Uriah was killed. Now, David's sin was discovered and dealt with by Nathan. Nathan was a prophet of God. So, in these sequence of events we see here, the first one deals with David and Bathsheba. The following lesson will address the subject of David and Uriah. And the third focused on David and Nathan. And we don't go into those verses when Nathaniel, or Nathan, let's call it Nathaniel, when Nathan confronted David, but he did, and that's when David knew, everybody knew that the sin was his. And even though David was still a man of God's own heart, he knew he had committed a very gross sin. And he fell down, he prayed to God, God, forgive me. And God will forgive any kind of sin. Even some of the gross sins that we see. People killed many people. And if they had asked God forgiveness, he would have forgiven them. But just like Hitler and some of the others, we're pretty sure from the accounts of his life, he did not ask God for forgiveness. So we probably know where he is. Well, in thinking about this one a little bit deeper, maybe Bathsheba should not have exposed herself as she did in indiscretion. Some think maybe it was deliberate. She knew David was there, and she knows simply that Uriah may never come back, and so she wanted to be taken care of. And she kind of worshiped David as a king, and so maybe that was part of it. So when Adam and Eve sinned, God specifically indicted Adam and Eve and the serpent. Each received their curse. So this is simply not the case with Bathsheba. Nowhere in the Bible is she indicted for this sin. So God probably knew that she didn't do it on purpose. But it came back to David. It's very clear in Samuel that the tragedies which take place in David's household are the consequences of his sin, just as Nathan indicates. God said that David was a man after his own heart, mostly because David worshiped God daily. Then after his sin with Bathsheba, daily, truly, and sincerely asked for forgiveness. And God still indicated that because of his sin and the murder of Uriah, that David would not be permitted to build a temple for God. And he really wanted to do that. So, probably was not all the wars and bloodshed that occurred in dealing with Saul and after and became king and protecting Israel, but it was the killing of Uriah, murder of Uriah, that said that David no longer could build this. And the temple then would be built by David's son, Solomon. So in this we know that David did not honor the marriage of Uriah and Bathsheba. And even though in those days David could have more than one wife, there was still a dishonorable of the marriage there and the murder of Uriah. This was a law probably hard to understand today, why there's more than one marriage partner back in those days. We'll get into that another time. But in any case, this gets into the fact that we need to honor all marriage vows. Thanks for watching. I hope you've enjoyed this one, and you will watch it again if you want to.